Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I've enjoyed being here all day and learned a lot from the faculty presentations and the student presentations. And so now I'm going to try to talk about some themes that I think are related, and I'm going to talk about really about three things. One is the notion of expertise. A second is the design of tools that either automate or collaborate with people. And the third thing I want to talk about is technology exposure itself and how I think about that. Hopefully this will be interesting and useful, and here we go. So my talk is called Expertise, Artificial Intelligence, and the Work of the Future. So I'm going to start off by asking a rhetorical question. What is the difference between these two jobs, air traffic controller and crossing guard? I think we can agree that these are basically the same job, right? The job is to prevent things from colliding, children, cars, airplanes, runways, etc. And yet, crossing guards make less than 25% of what air traffic controllers do. So why is that? Well, the obvious answer is something about skills, right? To become a crossing guard requires no training or certification in any US state. To be an air traffic controller takes several years of air traffic control school, thousands of hours of practice. So you might think, oh, it's human capital. But I want to make a more specific point that it really has to do with expertise, it has to do with know-how. So one way to say this is, if we suddenly ran out of crossing guards, we could get the air traffic controllers to do that work. But if we ran out of air traffic controllers, we couldn't get the crossing guards to do that work, right? Because there's specialized expertise in that job and not specialized work in that job. So let me define terms. Expertise means domain-specific knowledge or competency to accomplish some specific goal. It could be baking a loaf of bread, coding an app, diagnosing a patient, remodeling a kitchen, repairing a water heater. Not all expertise. So expertise is crucial to the value of labor in industrialized countries where so much physical work has been replaced. But not all expertise is valuable. To be valuable, you need two things. One is the goal that enables must itself be valuable, right? So it's got to be data science, not card tricks. And then the other thing is it must be scarce, right? Because if everyone is expert, no one is expert, right? Expertise means something that some people can do and not everyone can do. And that's critical because it emphasizes that expertise is a dynamic notion, right? A form of expertise that you possess now may suddenly become worthless because we no longer need it or because we've automated it. A new form of expertise may become important because we have a new tool or technology that requires it. So expertise is dynamic. Your schooling, right? Whatever years of school you attain, that won't change for the rest of your life. But the expertise you possess and the value of that expertise will change a lot. And lots of expertise is acquired not through schooling. People who are in the trades, people who are in skilled repair, right? They have lots of expertise, not schooling. So by expertise, I mean something much more specific. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because non-expert work pays poorly, right? Waiters, cleaners, janitors, security guards, school bus drivers, daycare teachers, crossing guards. The last three of those are life and death activities, right? They determine whether our kids make it back at the end of the day. Yet they're poorly paid in almost every country. And the reason is because they're not expert, because there's an abundant supply of people who can do that work without a lot of training or certification. So now I want to give you a brief history of expertise. So I want to start with the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution in its second stage gave rise to what I call mass expertise, which means the ability to use tools and follow rules. So whether on an assembly line making cars or in an office doing information processing, right? This era was about using literate and numerate labor to do specialized work. It wasn't highly specialized, but you actually had to know something to work in an office or to work on an assembly line. You got better at it. You invested in that skill set. And this was an enormous change from the era that preceded it, right? The artisanal era. 70% of people were in agriculture, 30% were artisans. Artisans were highly skilled individuals who were doing, making things from front to back, enormous complexity, very slow, hard to acquire, lifetime investment, not a fast way to make stuff, but they were revered. That skill set was wiped out by automation, right? And so we ended up in a different era of mass expertise. And because it was sufficiently productive and because we had lots of other supporting institutions like unions, like laws, this led to pretty broad prosperity in this part, or enabled pretty broad prosperity in a lot of industrializing countries from essentially, kind of 1860, 1880 to the early 1980s. But then, of course, we moved into another era, the era of the computer revolution. And that really automated a lot of the mass expertise that people were using in offices and factories. Let me just remind you by showing you your first personal computer, the Jacquard Loom of 1801. So what made this a computer, distinct from all other previous machines, was that it was a symbolic processor, right? Those brass cards it's a program that the loom follows to lift the hooks, to weave fabrics. This is not paint by numbers, those are instructions. So this was a symbolic processor. It was such a powerful idea. Herman Holrith was inspired to create the paper punch card, used to read the 1890 US Census from looking at this machine, and he joined forces with Thomas Watson to form IBM. Right? So the great thing about the Jacquard Loom and all computers that followed it is it follows rules and it can use tools, right? A lot like that mass expertise. But one advantage it had was that the price of computing, once you could write the program, fell 1 trillion-fold between 1950 and 2010. So if it would cost $1 trillion in 1950 to do a stack of calculations, it would cost $1 in 2010 to do that same set of calculations. That created enormous competition for labor, and it led substantially, not exclusively, to this displacement of office and clerical, administrative support, production, and operative work that was expert work, followed rules, used tools, but was codifiable because we understood the rules and procedures. And so it helped contribute to this barbell, which we see in many countries. Now, if you're on the right-hand side of that barbell, professional, technical, and managerial work, that's great, right? Because not only does this offload your repetitive tasks, but it gives you access to information and calculation. It makes you more effective. It makes you more specialized. If you're doing marketing or medicine or research or design or architecture, this tool is highly complementary to you. But for the folks who would have been in the middle and who didn't have college degrees, many of them found themselves doing those services at the bottom, right? Personal services, cleaning and protective services, and so on. Socially valuable work, poorly paid because it is an expert. Now you might say, well, why not the ends of the scale? Why just the middle? And the answer comes down to what some call Polanyi's paradox, after philosopher Michael Polanyi, who said, look, we know more than we can tell. Meaning there are many, many things that we do that we don't know how we do them, right? So riding a bicycle or telling a joke or coming up with a hypothesis or even, washing dishes. And they're hard to automate. We couldn't automate things. We couldn't computerize things that we didn't know the rules for, right? So that was a very hard constraint on the way that automation proceeded for the first 5 decades of the information era. But that begins to change again, in fact, very rapidly, in the artificial intelligence era, right? So just to emphasize what is different about artificial intelligence is that it can do tasks and learn to do tasks that look nothing like those rules and procedures types of tasks, right? It can learn from unstructured information, right? It can do tasks that you would think of as creative if they were done by a person. It can discover and invent autonomously, right? And this is a superpower. It's quite different. And it really means, because unlike traditional computers where we have to write the rules and then it follows them, it can learn inductively. It can recognize patterns. It can make predictions. And that allows it to do a whole range of different things that were not previously possible. So it really is a fundamental break. It is not a better, cheaper, faster version of anything, right? It's actually a terrible traditional computer. You do not want an AI spreadsheet, right? You don't want an AI dictionary, right? It's not reliable with facts and numbers, but it's good for other things. And of course, AI has been woven into daily life for quite a while, right? So if your watch asks you if you've taken a fall, if your car tries to steer you back in the lane on the highway, if your word processing software offers to assist you with your writing assignment, these are all instances of AI sort of reading the context. You should read that. And trying to interpret what you want and help you along the way. So AI is a tool. It's a tool like a calculator or a chainsaw. But what type of a tool is it? So I'm going to distinguish between 2 broad buckets of tools. These are not equal size buckets. I'm going to call them automation tools and collaboration tools, right? So an automation tool is a tool that removes all the expertise from a task. Something that used to require some skill, expertise, no longer does, right? Dishwasher, automatic teller machine, automatic transmission. In America, no one knows how to drive a stick shift. No one. Electronic toll taker, right? These are all devices that take something that used to require human expertise and they fully encapsulate it so it was done automatically. And that's great, right? Where automation works, right? None of us wants to go back to the era of waiting at toll booths, right? Or of having an elevator operator. So good automation is a good thing. As I'll emphasize in a minute, bad automation can undermine expertise. The second type of tool is what I'm going to call collaboration tools. Most tools are collaboration tools. They augment the value of human expertise. They're a force multiplier for expertise. They're not a replacement for it, right? So a stethoscope, a chainsaw, a word processor, right? Those are useful to some, not very useful to others, and dangerous to many, right? Or, if you're an air traffic controller and you don't have a GPS and a two-way radio and a radar, right? You're nothing, right? You can't do your job. You're just staring at the sky, right? Looking for planes, right? So in many ways, tools, collaboration tools, are the implements by which we apply our expertise, right? They shorten the distance between intention and result. They amplify the value of what we know, right? So these are two ways to use tools. So here is a problem. Good automation and good collaboration tools are both widespread, but bad automation tools interfere with collaboration. They are not different versions of the same thing. And that's the point I want to elaborate over the next few minutes. So let me talk about how bad automation can undermine human expertise. So let's start with the autopilot. This is an autopilot you would find standard equipment on a Boeing 787. It's just that thing highlighted in yellow, right? You just dial in where you want the plane to go. It works pretty well until it doesn't work well, right? So here you probably are all familiar, this being France, of Air France Flight 447, which crashed tragically in 2009. This was a bad interaction between automation and human expertise. So let me describe to you, actually I'm going to read to you from David Mindell's book about this, or just about this part of it. David Mindell is both a historian and a mechanical engineer at MIT, one of my colleagues. So here we go. So when the pilots of Air France 447 were struggling to control their airplane, falling 10,000 feet per minute through a black sky, pilot David Robert exclaimed in desperation, "We've lost all control of the airplane. We don't understand anything. We've tried everything." At that moment, they were actually flying a perfectly good airplane. Yet the combination of startle, confusion, at least 19 warning and caution messages, inconsistent information, and a lack of recent experience hand flying the aircraft led the crew to enter a dangerous stall. Recovery was actually possible using the old technique for unreliable aircraft, which is just to put it down level and wait for it to catch the wind. But the crew can make sense of the situation to see their way out. And the conclusion of the accident report was a total loss of cognitive control of the situation, right? So what does this emphasize, right? The autopilot was an automation tool that worked 99% of the time, but the other 1% of the time, it was actually interfered with people using their expertise. One, they were out of practice, but two is it just overwhelmed them. They couldn't, the handoff was a terrible handoff, right? I'm going to come back to that, but let me first give you an AI version of this problem, not nearly as catastrophic, right? So you probably have read about a paper by Nikhil Agrawal and T.B.S. Sells and Alex Mooring about Chexpert, Chest X-ray Expert. It's an AI that is designed to read X-rays. And this is a good application of AI, right? Because X-rays, reading X-rays, no hard and fast rules. There's a lot of judgment. To become a radiologist, you spend 4 years in residency, you're overseen by an expert radiologist, and you learn the field. And so this thing can be read fed tens of thousands of labeled scans, and can acquire that judgment. And it's pretty good. Looking at scans alone, it does better than 2/3 of radiologists. Now, radiologists don't look at scans alone, right? So that's an artificial comparison. They actually look at a lot of ancillary information and so on, but just side by side. So you might think, right, that the radiologist and Chexpert would be even better. Stands to reason. But it turns out the radiologists do systematically worse with Chexpert than they do on their own. Why is that? Well, I could give you sort of two answers. One answer is, look, this is a tool just thrown at them, right? They never had a chance to figure out when they should trust it and when they shouldn't. And in fact, what happens is the X-ray and the radiologist, Chexpert and the radiologist are looking at the same scan. So they're often going to reach the same conclusion. So if the doctor is uncertain, often Chexpert will be quite uncertain. If the doctor is very confident, often the Chexpert will be very confident. What's the doctor supposed to do when they disagree? Well, when there's a lot of uncertainty, the doctors will tend to defer to Chexpert. When they're pretty confident, they'll tend to override Chexpert. Neither of those tends to be the right instinct, actually. When there's a lot of uncertainty, people are better at reasoning out of sample, When there's a lot of certainty, it's not that the expert can't be wrong, but it has seen more x-rays than any doctor will see in 100 lifetimes. So at least there's reason to ask, is it right? So one is they never had practice. They never had a flight simulator for Chexpert. But there's a deeper reason, which is this tool is meant to automate. It wasn't designed to collaborate with a radiologist. It says, here's what I think, done, right? Imagine you were in a radiology, you were looking at a scan, and you weren't sure what you saw. You would call in another radiologist, right? And they would give their opinion, and you might actually arrive at a conclusion that's different from what either of you thought initially, right? So collaboration requires communication and exchange of information. So this tool was not designed to do that. Now, there are other AIs that do, and it would obviously be possible to design an AI that collaborates, but it was not good at leveraging the expertise people had. It wasn't useless, but there's a way to do better. So now let me talk about the opposite case, collaboration tools, which are a force multiplier for expertise. So let's go back to the airplane example. So you may or may not know this, but most aircraft have a second navigation system called a heads-up display. That thing I've circled in green, it's just basically a green screen that you look through, and it gives you superhuman powers of perception, right? It shows you data that you couldn't see out of the corner of your eye, and I'll show you a video in 1 second, it summarizes for the pilot everything the plane understands about its current state, its velocity, its vector of travel, the wind conditions, the thrust from its motors simultaneously. So let me just show you a quick video of this. This is a pilot landing at LAX with a HUD. Let's see if I can get this going. Yes.
Clear land, Mr. Approach altitude is set.
All right, so that you can see the altitude. That little dot in the center is what the plane understands about itself. The runway is highlighted in green, right?
Runway inside.
And that little arrow of travel, that's the HUD telling the pilot what it thinks is going on. This does not have a spectacular ending. It lands safely, just if you're wondering.
100. 50, 40, 30, 20, 10.
Spoilers deployed.
Okay, cool. So, whoa, that was not my intention. That wasn't my intention either. So the HUD is also a tool, but it's a collaboration tool, right? There is never any pretense that it's flying the plane. It doesn't fly the plane. It just gives information to the pilot. Now, it turns out that one, pilots like this a lot. They feel they improve their flying while they're using it. Two, airlines have discovered they save millions of dollars a year by using this because there are fewer tail strikes and fewer tire blowouts that when a pilot is using a HUD than when they use the auto lander, which is the autopilot for landing, right? So these are both tools, right? And this one could fail, right? Let's be very clear. It's just a piece of software. It could go down at the last minute. However, there's no handoff, right? Because the pilot is flying the entire time. And this emphasizes a key difference between automation and collaboration tools. An automation tool, to be good, needs to be good almost all the time. And certainly you don't want it to fail just when it's most needed, right? A collaboration tool doesn't have to be good all the time, right? A stethoscope, it doesn't have to diagnose every ailment of a patient to be useful to you, right? It just needs to be useful some of the time. And so there are actually really different standards of what makes a good tool, right? And so both exist. They require a different design philosophy. One is not a step towards the other. Another way of saying this is Benjamin Disraeli, British Prime Minister, once said, like, the most dangerous strategy is to attempt to leap a canyon in 2 bounds, right? And partial bad automation is the first bound into the canyon, okay? So it matters how you design this. So now let me talk about what I mean by this, actually. So let me go, this was referenced earlier, right? This is the study by Brynjolfsson, Lee, and Raymond that looks at this tool that helps call center workers to provide services, to provide call support. And we saw a paper about this earlier today about a different call center and also really interesting results. So let me just briefly summarize what you see in this figure. So on the vertical axis is calls resolved per hour. On the horizontal axis is how many months people had worked at this job. And the folks in blue, they never use the AI, and it takes, after about 10 months, they go from 1.8 calls per hour to 2.5 calls per hour. So they're improving. The folks in green get the tool at 6 months, right? And they overtake, and by the end of 10 months, they're at 3 calls per hour. The people in red get the tool on day 1, and after 5 months, they're at 3.5 calls per hour, 3.25, right? So they're much better. What's impressive here is not that this makes people better, but that everybody starts off bad at this job, right? 1.8 calls per hour. So it's not that the tool is automating what they do, it's improving the rate at which they converge towards expert performance, right? It's helping them acquire expertise more efficiently. And that's really a great aspiration for a tool. So there's a lot to like here. This is just one example, but let me give you another example where I think this is relevant. So in the United States, we have an occupation called nurse practitioners. Nurse practitioners are registered nurses who have an additional year of medical training and practice, and that enables them to do things that previously were only allowed to be done by MDs. They can diagnose, they can treat, they can prescribe pharmaceuticals. This is an incredible expansion in the scope of practice of what nurses do. Now, this is not a technological phenomenon, right? This started in the 1960s when nurses said, hey, we're being underused here. We could do more. And they fought hard to create a credential, a scope of practice, a license, right? And the American Medical Association fought them every step of the way, right? They did not want this to occur. At this point, right, they make about $130,000 a year, which is a very good salary. Actually, adjusted for the cost of education, they may make as much over the lifetime as a general practitioner. It's expected to grow 40% in the next decade, and it's a really good job, and it's also a really good service for patients. Now, although this is not a technological phenomenon, nurse practitioners are highly augmented by collaboration tools at this point, right? They have access to electronic medical records, diagnostic software, software that looks for drug interactions, right? And so you can see the scope of things they can usefully do will expand because of that tool, right? And this is kind of my model of what using AI well would mean, is the world that we live in is dominated by guilds of highly educated, highly paid professionals like ourselves, right? Professors, lawyers, doctors, engineers, right? Designers, and they're expensive, they're elite, and they're not getting more productive. I know I'm not. And so it would be great if we could allow more people to do that valuable work. Just like as people were pushed out of the middle in the previous generation, if we could allow more people to do medical services, legal services, software development, right? Engineering design services. It'd be great if a kitchen contractor could redesign the kitchen simultaneously, right? With better tools, that will become more feasible. I'm not saying it will happen, right? But it is a viable aspiration that, and this actually points to a paradox that sometimes tools make something a little simpler, which allows more people to do it, right? And that's not altogether bad. So now let me move on to the next theme, right? So I want to tie together this notion of tools, expertise, and exposure to automation. And I want to talk about this concept of exposure came up a lot today, and I've been giving a lot of thought to that. I have a new paper about this called Expertise. And we're not alone in thinking about exposure, right? So here's Politico saying the IMF reports that 40% of all jobs are exposed to AI. AI exposure is the new buzz term to soften talk about job losses. Here's what it really means, right? And if you look, there are lots of economics papers, right, that have all kinds of exposure measures, okay? So I want to tell you why I think exposure is a very incomplete notion of how automation and technology interacts with jobs. And the starting point is you could think of an occupation being a bundle of tasks that are done together, right? And you can array them from less expert to more expert. Now, let's imagine we automate some of them. So the ones in orange are being automated here, okay? So what's going to happen? Well, labor productivity is going to rise, right? Expertise requirements are going to fall. We're dumbing this job down, right? Employment could plausibly rise. Why? Well, job's more productive and it requires less expertise. Maybe more people could do it. Wages might fall, right? Because you've lowered the barriers to entry. You have an increase in supply, potential supply. Now, let's look at the same occupation, and now we're going to automate the less expert tasks in that same occupation. Well, labor productivity will go up. Average expertise required to do the work will go up. Employment might not rise because you've made it harder to do this work, but plausibly, wages will rise, right? So it's quite possible for wages and employment to go in the opposite direction if technology changes the effective supply of people who can do a job. Now, I don't think this is as fanciful as it sounds. Consider, for example, the employment and wages of taxi and chauffeur drivers in the United States, right? Think Uber here, right? Their wages fell relative, they didn't grow as fast as other occupations over the last 40 years, but between 2000 and 2020, their employment grew 200%, right? That's the Uber effect, right? It lowered the barrier to entry, it probably reduced wage growth, it massively increased the number of people doing the work. Now consider the occupation of proofreaders, right? Proofreaders used to be a lot of checking spelling, checking references, and so on. Now it's about helping people write, at least pre-AI, right? Proofreader employment has fallen substantially, but wages have risen a lot, right? This is arguably a job that's become more expert as a result of automation. It's more specialized, it's higher paid, there are fewer people doing it. So that's a very simple idea. So I'll say in recent work with Neil Thompson, who's my colleague at MIT in the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab, we tried to put this idea into more rigorous practice, right? And that required us to do a few things. It required us to measure expertise and then to measure changes in expertise. So I'm going to give you a very short story about how we tried to do this. To measure the expertise of jobs, we drew on something called the efficient coding hypothesis. This is not about software. So the efficient coding hypothesis originates in perceptual biology. And it's basically this notion that, if you have a channel that you're trying to communicate, it has fixed bandwidth, you face a trade-off between compressed information, which goes across fast, and less compressed information that is much more likely to be understood. Now, so that's true for signal processing, but in language, it's also true. When you're speaking to another person, you have to have a theory about what they understand, right? So, if Steve and I met on an airplane and started talking, I would not use the word elasticity, right? But if I realized we were both economists, I would use the word elasticity, even if I was talking about the same concept, right? I would say, percentage change in X, percentage change in Y. Why? Well, that's a word that experts encounter a lot and non-experts don't. It's not because it's so sophisticated. Inflation is a word that we all know, right? You don't have to be an expert to use inflation. So expert words are words that are familiar to a discipline and not familiar to others. Not because they're so technical, but because it's a concept that some people encounter and others do not. This means, this idea says, well, you can recognize expert words in a body of text by looking for words that are infrequent and have low entropy. So what does low entropy mean? It means conditional on the word being uttered, you could guess where it came from. So if someone says elasticity, not a common word, you could say, oh, that dweeb is an economist. Whereas if someone says pernicious, right, that's also an infrequent word, but I could be a philosopher, right? I could be a writer. I could be just a pretentious person at a bar saying pernicious, right? So we use the efficient coding hypothesis to measure the entropy and frequency of words, and then we measure tasks in jobs according to their expertise level, right? So this shows you some expert and inexpert tasks, right? So for example, reinstalls plumbing and electrical and rigging connections, that's a high expertise task. Designs databases, sing a cappella or with musical accompaniment, high expertise tasks. Here's some low expertise tasks. Makes bed, print and make copies of work. But here, guard street crossings during hours when children are going to or coming from school, okay? Crossing guard. Now notice that has a lot of words, right? Inexpert doesn't mean short words. It just means familiar words, words that everybody knows. It doesn't require specialized knowledge. So we use this to measure the expertise of tasks and then aggregate them up to occupations. So just to give you some examples, here in the category of professionals, we have advertiser and economist. And you'll be happy to know that economists are much more expert than advertisers. And they duly make 25% more, which seems unjust. It should be higher, right? Or among technicians, practical nurses are less expert than lab technicians and they get paid less. Or among clerical workers, messengers versus statistical clerks. In services, housekeepers versus guard supervisors. So this actually turns out to be a kind of a content-free way of measuring how specialized work is. And it's actually quite predictive. So cross-sectionally, there's a very strong relationship between measure of expertise and earnings and occupations. That's true conditional on education as well, and even on occupational categories. So that's the first part. The next thing we do is we measure tasks added and removed from occupations over time. So to do that, we draw pictures of amoebas on a slide. No, to do that, we use word embeddings to look at tasks that are added and removed. So these tasks were written down 40 years apart. They don't use the same wording, but you can use embeddings to summarize them and look for things. So let me just show you this. You see these things are overlapping. That means those tasks are close together in meaning space, right? So tasks that, if we find them in 1977 and 2018, they're close together, we say, oh, that task has been preserved. If we find something in 2018, the red, that has nothing close to it from the 1977, we say, oh, that's a new task. If we find something in 1977 that has nothing close to it in 2018, we say, oh, that task was removed. So we can look at the tasks added and removed from occupations and look at the change in expertise as a result of what's added and what's removed. Like, so just to give you an example, here are file clerks, right? The purple ones are things that persist. And if you compare them, they use different language for the same idea, but they're very close together. May operate key punch to enter data on tabulating cards. That one doesn't have a match. That one has been deleted. We couldn't find anything close to it. Input data such as file numbers, new or updated information, or document information goes into computer systems to support document information retrieval. That's a new one, right? So this is how we measure the change in expertise in jobs. So where does this go? Well, we look at the relationship between expertise changes and wage changes at the occupation level. And so this may not surprise you, but occupations that appear to become more expert gain in relative terms. And you can become more expert either because inexpert tasks are removed or because expert tasks are added, right? You can lose expertise either because expert tasks are removed or inexpert tasks are added. And both work, actually, believe it or not. Now, we also look at changes in the quantity of tasks. Why do we do that? Well, you've all read the many papers about tasks, new tasks, old tasks, task removal. And those also have the predictive relationship to wages. They're not the same, but they're both there. So I want to emphasize that. But here's a crucial difference. When you look at employment, when expertise demands go up, relative employment falls, right? When expertise demands go down, relative employment rises. So that's like your Uber drivers, right? Whereas on the right, a change in the quantity of tasks that you do is always associated with more employment, right? So change in quantity of tasks is like a change in quantity demanded. Whereas a change in expertise is a change in the knowledge requirement of work, right? So what I want to emphasize with all that brief detour through that paper, well, it says that in jobs, tasks are bundled. So if you think of things only in terms of tasks and what tasks are automated, that in a world where we had atomistic task assignment, one skill to one task, or no task was ever done by two people, then that would be sufficient information. But that's not the way it works in reality. Many tasks are done by within one task done in many occupations. And so automating that task might be expertise increasing for one person and expertise decreasing for another. So just to give you a tiny example close to home, I have had the same wonderful administrative assistant for 2 decades. She also works for Daron Acemoglu, so she's good. And forever she's proofed my letters of recommendation, which I like to write late at night, assisted by alcohol. And but of course she doesn't work late at night. She may just be being assisted by alcohol in her leisure. So I recently discovered that I can use Claude to do those letters, right? And it's really quite good. It catches my errors, plus it makes useful suggestions. It's a terrible writer, right? Don't use Claude to write anything for you, but it's a great editor. Now, for me, that's like an expertise magnifier, right? It means I can actually write faster and better whenever I want to. For my assistant, this machine is automating away an expert task for her, right? In some sense, it's reducing the expertise requirements of her work. In the future, when MIT hires assistant administrators, they may not need someone with a college degree who's going to do the proofing if Claude does it. So same task. Now, let me say, people understand this, right? So why were they so upset about Uber, for example? This is a photograph that we call blood taxi. It's because they understood it's not that they didn't want faster routing, right? It's that they didn't want more customer convenience. They didn't want all that competition, right? They didn't want all that entry. They didn't want everyone else to be able to do their job, right? I'll give you another example. My colleague John Horton at MIT, his family runs a construction company. He has great construction tales. And so one thing that he told me I thought was so illuminating, right? So if you build a concrete wall, you put rebar, reinforcement steel bar in it to give it lateral strength. That's an unskilled activity. However, there is a skilled part of this job, and that's tying the rebar ends after the concrete has hardened. And that's a really skilled task. Now, it turns out there's now a machine you can buy at Home Depot or at a hardware store for about $2,000 that will tie the rebar ends. The construction workers hate it. And where they're unionized, they try to prevent firms from using it. Why do they hate it? Right? These guys have so many tools, right? They're practically cyborgs, right? They have, they have jackhammers, they have pneumatic hammers, right? They have screwdrivers. Why do they not like this tool? Well, it's natural, right? It's all of a sudden taking something that was an expert specialized skill of theirs and making it a commodity. Any idiot can now tie rebar. So people understand when a technology competes with them, it automates something that they do versus collaborating with them, making their expertise more useful. So automation both replaces expertise and complements experts. Okay, so in my final few minutes, I just want to talk, in the end of my talk, I want to talk about the end of work. So, here I am talking about expertise, the quality of work, and you might be thinking, right, well, will we have any work? And if you have that worry, you're not alone. You're in, I don't want to say good company, but you're in distinguished company. Here's Elon Musk saying, there'll come a point where no job is needed. And he even tried that in the US government, right? No jobs needed. Here's Jeff Hinton saying, get a job as a plumber, right? That's the only thing that's going to last, right? Jeff Hinton, right, won the Nobel Prize last year, inventor of neural nets. So I want to tell you two things that I think are misplaced about this argument. One, as you probably are all aware, we're not running out of jobs, we're running out of workers, right? In most of the industrialized world, the number of people who are age 20 to 64 is in precipitous decline. Not so much in France, actually, it turns out, according to this figure. But in Korea, in Poland, in Japan, Greece, Spain, Estonia, Italy, Portugal, Hungary, etc. So now, of course, we all recognize that's an artificial problem, right? There are many people throughout the world who would be happy to come to these countries and work, right? There's no sign in the US that we're taking advantage of that, but we could. So there's no evidence that we're running short on jobs. We may have low quality jobs, right, if they become an expert, but I don't think we're going to have not enough of them. But here's, I think, a more fundamental point, and this is not just so time specific. The most consequential innovations are not automation innovations, right? So mechanical flight, right, it didn't automate the way we used to fly, right? We just couldn't fly before we had airplanes. The scanning electron microscope did not automate the way we looked at subatomic particles, right? We just couldn't see them. If you went back to ancient Greece and automated all the stuff they did, right, you would not have a modern city, right? You'd have ancient Greece without horses, right? It wouldn't have flight, it wouldn't have telecommunications, it wouldn't have penicillin, right? What makes technologies impactful is not that they're a better, cheaper, faster version of something else, but that they enable new capabilities. They enable us to do things that we couldn't previously do. They were out of reach. And often, with new capabilities comes new demands for expertise. You can see these are all examples of occupations or specialized work that was added, detected by the US Census Bureau between 1940 and 2018. Some of these are tools, right? Automatic welding machine operator, textile chemist, controller of remotely piloted vehicles, wind turbine technicians, cybersecurity. So these are all about expertise in using tools. Some of these are just services that people demand as they get older or younger. Well, most people don't get younger, but societies get younger, or wealthier or poorer, right? So tattooers, mental health counselors, sommeliers. Now, I realize that's not new in France, I understand. And so on. Okay. And there's a lot of this. In a paper with Caroline Chin, Anna Salomons, and Brian Segmuller, we estimate that about 60% of the work people do in 2018 did not exist in its current form in 1940, right? Like, for example, a specific example, like, air conditioning mechanic or fuel injection mechanic, right? Those tools, those technologies hadn't been invented. Okay, so we don't have a good mechanism for forecasting where new work comes from, but it's pretty important. And I couldn't tell you if it will emerge as fast as old work will be automated, but it would be good if it were. I hope so. Okay, so let me kind of end with the following point. People are often asked to forecast the future, but the future is really not a forecasting exercise. It's a design exercise. It is not yet determined, right? It depends on lots of decisions that we collectively make. And that's certainly true for artificial intelligence as well. There are many, many ways to use it. right? I think we all agree we could use AI to improve education, to improve healthcare, to make agriculture more efficient, right? To treat ailments we don't have, to figure out how to generate power more efficiently, to solve fusion, to adapt to climate change. We also all agree we could also use it for weaponization, for invasive monitoring, right? For unwelcome pornography, right? Those are all possible. So your belief about which of those we'll do is not a belief about AI capabilities. It's a belief about human governance, right? It's a belief about how we will use these tools, not what we could use them for. And I think that's really humbling to realize how much choice we have, right? So we certainly can use AI for surveillance, right? For content monitoring, for real-time filtering. And you couldn't do that at the scale it's done without this technology. No question, right? But that's not intrinsic to AI. That's one way of deploying it. And that's an expensive way, right? That you had to make a big investment in that. You can similarly use it for assisting with elder care, providing real-time information to people who are doing construction or repair, right? And even Google Glass was coming back, right? Hopefully to be used for this, or to make education more immersive, more engaging, less expensive, more accessible, right? So these are choices we should make. We have to make. So let me just end with some questions we might be asking. One is, when should we build automation versus collaboration tools? They're both useful. But I would say that the hubris of our era is, look, AI is already superhuman, so obviously it's going to automate everything, right? But that's just not true. There are many, many things that are out of reach of automation right now. Jeff Hinton, the founder of neural nets, right, predicted 10 years ago, radiologists will be done in 5 years, right? We're done with those guys. They're not done, actually. They're busier than ever. They use AI all the time. It allows them to do more work, diagnose more ailments. They're more useful, but they spend a lot of their time interacting with other medical practitioners and so on. It was complementary. It was a collaboration tool for them. It was not an automation tool. But if you think everything can be automated, right, then you're going to design a lot more autopilots and a lot fewer heads-up displays. And that may not work very well because bad automation is bad for collaboration. So it's really a choice. It's not a halfway house. You have to decide what you're aiming for. And I think too much of the technology community is aiming for automation. Nothing morally wrong with automation, but it's really not in reach for many things. And so we should design differently. If we do build these tools, we want them, right? Expertise, I've said how great it is. It's incredibly slow. It's incredibly fallible. It's incredibly expensive. We would like tools that enable people to deploy their expertise more effectively, i.e. make fewer mistakes, and acquire it more efficiently, right? Get better at stuff faster. A good AI tool would be one that allows us to develop our judgment and skills more quickly. And that's something that I and others are working to experiment on. How do we ensure that these tools are broadly available where they're needed? How do we incentivize firms and organizations to consider using AI for collaboration, not just for automation? And again, I think there's this excessive focus on automation when it's not in reach. But all the messages are, that's what this is for. It's not. For some of that, but not all. And of course, how do we get governments and industries and universities and non-governmental organizations and labor representatives? This is a collective decision problem. That's what makes it so hellish, right? Because if you have uncertainty about that this is going to go badly, it's because you think the collective decision process is imperfect, and it is imperfect. So let me end on a happy note. My Whirlpool washing machine has more processing power than the Apollo guidance computer that was used to land the first person on the moon in 1966. And this allows, in my washing machine, I can actually start the rinse cycle from anywhere on the planet where there is Wi-Fi, right? And this is completely useless. And my washing machine is never going to the moon, right? So what makes a technology impactful and useful is not the inputs that go into it, but the imagination that says we have a new capacity to accomplish something we previously couldn't do. And that, when we think about how to use AI well, I think beyond replicating human capabilities, of which we have many, we should be looking for more moonshots. And that's where a lot of the value will come from. Thanks very much.